everyone, I'm Bandish, the founder of The Curious Mindset, a private community for technology leadership teams powered by 64 Tech, an IT solutions provider of hardware, cloud, and IT services. Now, although we're powered by 64 Tech, our core principle is to always give more than we take. Rest assured, you won't be bombarded with sales pitches. Please do follow our dedicated LinkedIn page for updates on how 64 Tech can help you with any technology challenges or shake things up with your current IT suppliers. While 64 Tech provides technology solutions, some of the biggest challenges tech leaders face are human, not technical. As leaders, there's often pressure to appear all-knowing, which makes it hard to admit what we don't know or ask questions that allow us all to be vulnerable. The Curious Mindset was created to help us build the essential people and leadership skills we didn't know we needed. This community grew out of my own experience and my desire to help others overcome the challenges that I faced when I became a leader. I know firsthand how isolating leadership can be, and our North Star here is that no one leads alone. At 64 Tech, the mantra is "Together we grow," and the Curious Mindset is how we can make that happen. This is a space for us to learn, share, and grow more confident as technology leaders. Our mission to help technology leaders become the best versions of themselves. Before I hand over, just a quick reminder to RSVP to our first sponsored in-person event next Thursday the 6th at Langan's in Mayfair, London. We'd love to see you there. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our host, Andy McMenemy, our technology leader co-host, Steve Maxwell, and our special guest, John Dore.
Bandish, thank you so much for that introduction. And as always, guys, we've got to thank Bandish and 64 Tech for being so generous in sponsoring the Curious Mindset. Today's guest is going to be an absolute pleasure for me because I'm always fascinated with how we deepen connections and how we deepen relationships. And when I think back over my 22-year corporate career, I absolutely can recognize those leaders that built resilience into their relationship with me. And in fact, in many times, I found myself following them and eventually working with them again in different positions in different organizations. So it's my great pleasure to invite to the Curious Mindset today, John Dore, the best-selling author of the #1 business book last year, Glue. John, welcome to the Curious Mindset.
It's nice to see everybody. It's great. In fact, I can't see everybody, so if you don't, if your office is as messy as mine, feel free to keep your camera on. And if you're in a workplace where there's people working in the background, it makes it even more exciting. So yeah, it's great to be with you, and happy to talk about whatever's on your mind, Andy.
Well, John, I think I'm just going to hand over to you and let you take us through what you'd like to talk about today, because I'm fascinated by all of the subjects you're going to cover.
Yeah, okay, so we don't have too long. I mean, normally when I sort of get a group, I sort of try and, lock the doors and keep them there for as long as possible, because I think the topic's important. Essentially what I've been doing is for about the past 20 years, I've been working with leaders all over the world. I've had the pleasure of working for a sort of prestigious business school for the past 10 years and also running my own business, running leadership programs. And that gives a really interesting platform for sort of insight and for feedback and for research. And I'll give you the conclusion for that research straight away. Leading has never been more difficult today than it ever has been. And the bad news is it's going to get more difficult in the future. It constantly amazes me who people have made that transition from supervisor to manager to leader and suddenly have responsibilities not just for the enterprise, but also have responsibility for people and taking people with you. And I think that's got harder in the last few years. And I've got a few materials I can share with you why I think that's the case. I've also got some questions for you that I want to pose to the group as well. But the key thing I just want to sow in your mind at the moment is that all of these forces, all of these trends, all of these themes that are making leadership more difficult, the answer to them is always the same thing. It's always the leadership behaviors of the leader himself or herself. So those leadership behaviors that you exhibit have an enormous impact. And I'm going to show you some examples. In fact, I'm going to show you a couple of examples, if I can, from the tech world as well that might do that.
Please
So
do,
if you
John.
don't mind, Andy, if you don't mind, I'll share a few things. Is that okay? We'll do.
Brilliant. Go for it.
Yes,
You've got a
go for it.
captive audience here.
Yeah, go for it. Okay, let's just try and see if this will work for you. So we call this session "Transforming Leadership in a Hybrid World." That's where we all work now. Though the interesting thing I think about technology leaders is you're sort of ahead of the game. A lot of your colleagues in organizations are sort of coming to terms in the last 3 or 4 years with this whole concept of hybrid working. But obviously, if you've been a technology leader for a while, you've always had remote data centers. You've always had a mixture of people in the office and out of the office. You've always had engineering in another country and people closer to hand. So you've always had this dynamic of having to manage people who are both close to you and also far away as well. So I've been looking at this idea of a hybrid world, and there's a few things going on that. As I said, the credentials are essentially working with leaders and doing a lot of listening. I'll come back to that point in a second. And I'm always amazed that this is what you have to do. The number of plates you have to spin as a leader, there's more and more and more of them. And the interesting thing is not that there's more and more plates and the plates are more and more hard to keep in the air. It's what is the most important plate? Where do you focus your time and energy? How do you discern between the noise and what's really, really important? And, we can put it in the chat or you can just have a little bit of a think about it. But when you think of all those plates you're spinning, what's the most challenging bit of that? What actually is the most difficult thing? And when you think about what's the most difficult thing, is it the most important thing? Often the most challenging thing is to do with resources or projects or funding or timelines or organizational politics. Often the things that are most challenging aren't necessarily the things that are most important or the most impactful. So have a think about that. What's the most important thing for you? And then what's most challenging? Now, why are things most challenging? Just three things. Three things I think have happened literally in the last 5 years. I think leading has changed. The nature of leading itself has changed. I think working has changed, and we all know that, in a hybrid world. I'll spend a little bit of time on that. And then I think also workers have changed. The people you're trying to engage in the organization, the demographic and the mix has changed radically. And as I said, everybody's expected to be a hybrid manager now. So the organizations you're supporting, the managers and the leaders you're working with, they're under pressure and under stress in a way they've not been. Because it's a rare skill set to manage disparate resources. It's not easy. You have to have a particular approach, and we'll come on to that. I think also there's a motivational issue. Andy will have talked about this before. For a lot of people, working's a slog. If you look at the data, employee engagement is down, productivity down, and employees, if they are with you, often are elsewhere. Their mind is elsewhere, their heart and their ambition is elsewhere. And also in the UK in particular, the benefits of hard work have never been less certain for people as well. So you've got a leadership issue, you've got a working issue, and then obviously workers have changed. You've got these multi-generational workforce, a diversity of workforce in terms of outlook, values, and ambitions, and you've got to manage that. So the dynamics of colleagues are now radically different. So spinning those plates was difficult, but spinning those plates is becoming more difficult because of these three trends which you've been having to contend with. I mean, when I used to started work, that's where I went. I went to this place. I'd generally go on a Monday, and then on a Tuesday, and then on a Wednesday and Thursday. On Friday, you might be able to wear some jeans or maybe leave a little early, but essentially that was the world of work. And if I met an IT professional in the organization, I probably met them in person. They'd probably rock up to my desk and play with some cables or tell me to switch it off and switch it on again. But I did have proximity in those places. The world's very different now. The organizations are more complicated. It used to be simple. It used to be straightforward organizations like this. I spent 10 years working for HSBC, and it was exactly the same model. It's just everybody I worked with happened to be called Alan. I don't know why that was the case. But the office is everywhere now. Organizations are, extremely complicated. The office is everywhere. And you've got to manage in that context. You've got to manage and lead in that context. So a lot of the debate and a lot of things that sort of talk about in this book are sort of this idea of it's about the mode now. It's about hybrid and in-person, office and home and flexible working. It's almost like the debate of the year. In fact, a couple of big organizations kicked the whole year off by making this a strategic play, the decisions they make about that. Now, that. The interesting thing, though, is what do you do about it? So I'm going to give you two paradigms to think about. You've got a little bit of time here. You're probably wrestling with this anyway. You're either on the left-hand side here, you're in a workplace with people, or you're working from home, you're working in isolation. And this seems to be the thing. It's enormously popular working from home now. I think the Office of National Statistics said there's now 44% of all UK employees work for a large proportion of their time at home. They're not in a traditional workplace setting. But likewise, there's some organisations are encouraging people to come back to work. And I think what it's being described as is sort of like two different ways of getting the best out of people. Is it better to have them close in proximity, or is it better to give them freedom? There's a strong theory around self-determination where you give people autonomy, give them space, you actually get more out of them. Now, I think the interesting thing is for you to think about as a leader is not necessarily about the setting of the work. It's not necessarily about where people are working, the mode. It's about what you're actually looking for those people to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you one of the things that's been played back to me, and I just want to see what you think about it. We'll take the slides down and get your view. One of the arguments for working from home or working from remotely or working anywhere else is it shouldn't really be about presenteeism. It should be about outputs. It should be about, if you're contactable, you get the work done, you make a clear contribution, you got the quality of work, you meet the deadlines, you're available, you're personally productive, you're contributing, you've got connectivity with people, and you've probably got better well-being. Then isn't that a goal we should go for? Isn't that a good goal we should go for? Now, I think most people go, yeah, I get that. And there's a strong argument placed. If you go online, you see a lot of the debates about this. There's a lot of argument that you're going to get better personal productivity by people having them away from the office, able to work in their own way. And I sort of get that. But the thing I'll offer to you is that probably you came through your career, you had to do all those things, but you also had to do all these as well. You had to show up, you had to get known, you had to offer a view, you had to learn as you go, you had to build relationships, you had to get visible, make some mistakes, get on with others, be sociable. You'd probably work long hours, but part of that was about, the presenteeism and wanting to be visible. So is it about inputs or outputs? Is it about, if you're progressing your career, and particularly if you're a young person in an organization and you're being led by you, is it about inputs or is it about outputs? I'll stop there if I can. I'll just stop the share there and just see whether there's any views online just to what I've said. I haven't told you anything you don't already know, but is there a view online? Anybody got a view that is it about inputs or is it about outputs? If you're thinking about your team and how you value them and how you get the most out of them, is it about the inputs or is it about the outputs?
I know certainly in my career, John, it was definitely about the outputs. It was all results oriented. They didn't mind how you got the results as long as you got them. And that was quite hard driven.
Yeah, I can see some of these. Yeah, I mean, of course, there's a yes and, isn't there? Always is. It's always about the the outputs. But also, if you think about it, if you have a performance evaluation nowadays, almost every performance evaluation is not just about what you output, it's about the way you did things as well, the way you led the organization, the way you sort of built those relationships, the way you did things. It's the way you sort of might do, not just do the thing right, but do the right thing. Not just do the thing right, but do the right thing. So you've got these inputs and outputs, I think, are something to think about. I've written this little book, and hopefully you'll get a chance to have a look at it. I've gone big on inputs, and I would argue that all of you are on this call, and all of you are in organizations where you've been given leadership roles because you've thrived with inputs. You've thrived with building relationships and connectivity. It's not just been about your outputs. It's not just about inputting into the cloud and it adding up and being aggregated and it being right. It's about your personal contribution. Inputs are enormously important, I think. So I'll just offer you a couple of other things. If I can go back to this, hopefully there's a couple of other things I'll just share with you just to take this on. There's a problem. There's a problem for all organizations now, particularly in Europe. It seems to be in Europe. That despite all these goodies, despite this sort of transfer from a in-office world to a more flexible, remote and hybrid working world, productivity is still flatlining. It's hard to get more from people. If you look at employee engagement, if you look at the Gallup studies over the last few years, it's actually fallen in 2022, 23, and 24. Employee engagement's fallen despite all the goodies of flexibility and remote, and retention's faltering. It's harder than ever to attract and retain talent. I'm really puzzled by this. There was a big European survey this year run by a gentleman called Mario Draghi, tried to look at this and said these things are like perennial leadership problems that need a solution. So what's the solution? Well, one solution might be hybrid working. We've sort of introduced blended working, so the organizations are not only flexible in terms of the working environment, they're flexible in terms of the resources you have. Very few people who work for you now. They're consultants or contractors or grid workers or freelancers. Some are part-time, some are full-time. In the UK, there might even be 0 hours. And all of you now work in this crazy matrix. We've made organizations extremely complicated where if you're a leader, you've got to manage somebody in a remote environment who's a gig worker in a global function, or is in a flexible working environment who's a freelancer who works in the head office. You've got to manage that complexity. The buttons and the levers you need to press have actually changed. I'll skip over a couple of things here, but I'll just offer a couple of things. There are different views. There are different views. I don't know if you've seen this recently. These were, two of my favorite. One is the CEO of Starbucks, who lives in Southern California. He commutes by private plane to the office once a week, goes up to Seattle, 4,000 people in Seattle. He wants to stay in his home office. The other one's Andy Jazz. Some of you may actually even already work for Amazon or work for organizations that support them. They've issued one of these return to office mandates. I don't think necessarily either's going to work. Either approach is going to work because they both miss the crucial ingredient. And I sort of mentioned at the beginning, which was about leadership behaviors, and I'll come back to that. So what are the buttons and levers you need to press? What do you need to do? What I think you need now is, if you think of all those changes that are going on, you need a different kind of leadership for the way we now work and live our lives. We need a different kind of leadership. The old ways we learned to lead in the sort of, early noughties and, the early part of this decade were all very worn, and they're all born out of an industrial age in the 20th century. We need a new kind of leadership needed for the way we now work and live our lives. Different habits, different ways of behaving, different ways of doing things. This came to me during the pandemic. I don't know, I did a job where I've been employed for a number of years on the basis that I bring people together into a tight and closed space, get them to collaborate closely together, come up with some ideas, and then sort of go down the pub together. Now, that not only became impossible in 2020 and part of 2021, it was actually illegal for a while. You weren't allowed to do that. Now, that was frustrating for me. We've pivoted online. But, for young people, I think that was profoundly difficult. If you were in school or in higher education, I think that was profoundly difficult. But it made me think about this, and I really, really want you just to hone in on this next thing I'm going to share, if you could. It really made me think about, when you go to work, what do you get? I know you get a pay slip. Hopefully it's never enough. It's never enough, and there's always too much taken away. But hopefully you do get a pay slip at the end of the month. But have you ever thought about this? It made me think during the pandemic, what's work about? What's work really about? Because if you go to work, and if you work for a good organization, I know there are some bad organizations, people work where there's malfeasance and bad bosses and things like that. But if you work for a good organization, and if it's well led, you get all this stuff for free. It's just staggering. It's not on your pay slip. It's not in the job description. It's not there. You get all this stuff for free. And you're all being beneficiaries of it. You've all been beneficiaries of what's called social capital, or what might be called glue. You're all beneficiaries of these things that emerge in organizations where you meet friendship and gossiping and dawdling and high-fiving and gratitude. You meet friends and enemies and all these other things. Now, I don't know if the technology will work here, Andy, but I'll give it a go. For me, during the pandemic, it sort of went going, it all became a bit fragile. Suddenly these things, what's really, really important to you becomes enormously fragile. And I thought you've got to go away and do something about that. I'll give you the solution. I said it's about leadership behaviors. It's about this, whether it's hybrid, whether it's in person, whether it's remote, wherever it is, whether it's offshore, onshore, part-time, flexible, hybrid, however you term it. The key to it is about the quality and depth of relationships, connections, and collaborative behaviors in an organization. You can have a completely 100% disparate organization, but it needs this. It needs this connectivity. I call it glue. You could call it whatever you like. You may well already call it something else in your organization, but really thinking deeply about this and what can you do? So as I said, you've got all those plates to spin. If there's one plate, I just ask you to spin a little bit more, is think about what you could do in this space here. How could you deepen the amount of glue in the organization? There's a lovely quote here from a guy called John Dore. He talked about this is in a social context, not in a business context. But if you're going to work in an organization, these connections you have and these natural relationships you have, they're not a given. You have to be intentional about creating them. You as a leader have to be completely obsessed with how are you making this work, how are you making it knit. It's an endless effort, said Boudoir, to do that. This is the model I'll share with you. This is this glue model, which I think was one of the things why the book did quite well, because it's relatively simple, like all the nice things. Basically, what there's a gentleman called Samantha Ghoshal. He argued if you're going to create these relationships, it's not just good for you and it's not just good for them. It's actually good for the business. It's actually good for the business. And he says it starts with social capital. It starts with those connected relationships of an organization. If you have them, it creates intellectual capital, new ideas, innovation, knowledge. You'll know all about that, new products, new services. And if you do that, it creates what's called an organizational advantage. And if you think about it intuitively, it makes sense, because if you just have an organization built on knowledge, ideas, experimentation, and creativity, it needs a human factor. It needs some energy behind that. But where do we focus our time? Certainly if you came to a class with me at a business school, we'd spend all our time there. We'd spend all our time talking about knowledges and ideas and innovation. We'd spend all our times about the challenges of customer centricity and improvement and productivity. But Ghoshal argues it starts there. How much time do you have focused on that area there? Your people, their connection, their collaboration, their friendship, their reciprocity, their trust. If you tune in more into that, doesn't matter where they are in the world, but you make that a little small more percentage of your time, it can have an enormous impact. So I'll ask you, on that dimension, you've got 100 plates to spin. If one of them is this glue plate, what are you doing? What could you do more? And what does best in class look like? I'm going to give you this one last thing, and then I'll hand back to Andy. I came across this the other day. I don't know whether he's online, but I came across this guy, Dan Richards. He's based down in Devon, and he runs this thing called Tech Southwest. And I've been to a couple of their events. I've spoken to a couple of their events online. A lot of those tech companies are very small, like 4 people or 1 or 9, and that's the whole company. But there's dozens of them all over the southwest of England. So they don't have the benefit of a fancy hand office or even necessarily the budgets for a shared workspace. But what they've increasingly trying to do is get this, what Dan calls an ecosystem, get people with connectivity and relationships outside of those organizations, shared problems, shared ideas, new initiatives. People move around, and now they've started to move that, as our host just said at the beginning, starting to do some face-to-face events as well as just keeping people connected. What they're trying to do is build this depth of relationships and connections and collaborative behaviors amongst the group. I call it glue. It's a really simple model. We don't have time to go through it, but if you get a chance to look at the book, it's quite simple. It's about galvanizing others, but you've really been focused on galvanizing. It's about having time to listen. It's a lot of leaders spend a lot of time broadcasting. It argues listening. It's a lot about what Andy said about engaging widely and deeply in the organization, but it's also about this, the secret sauce, the secret sauce. It's what's unusual about you. What's not normal or average or predictable or understood about you, but lean into your unusual self. You have to do it more and more in a hybrid world. What is it about you, your quirky, fantastical self, that you can share a little bit more with others? Last thing from me, if I just get to this, I haven't got time to do all of these little stories, but I'll come back to them and come share the slides with you afterwards if you want. There's some ideas I've started there and I could share with you. I'm not going to talk about engage. I just want to talk about this one, this listening. Okay, last thing from me. I think listening's your leadership superpower. Because if you think what's happened when we had the initial days of the pandemic, everybody went into broadcast mode. We suddenly had these tools and technology where we could be connected, and we went into broadcast mode with one another. You'd attend all hands meetings, town halls. You'd be constantly invited to socials online, all this. And I don't know whether they really worked. I think they're a little bit of a sticky plaster. But what I think we did is in our rush to engage by broadcasting, we did a little less listening. And I just want to share two quick stories. One story is from Sky. I don't know if we've got anybody from Sky on here, but I met the chief executive of Sky, Jeremy Darroch, and he was telling me this story where he went into one of their contact centers and he saw this lady there. He'd met her before on a contact center, and she said to him, "Jeremy, you're never happy. You're never happy." And he said, "What do you mean?" He says, "You're always got this change program, that change program, this transition thing, this transformation. You're never happy. You're never happy." And he says, "Oh no, we're just trying to, you're just trying to, No, no, he said, "You're not never happy. Everybody just feels like everything we're doing is wrong all the time." Anyway, Jeremy took this to heart. They went back to their board meeting and talking about that. He had that one little moment of listening, walk around the floor, do a little bit of listening. And they had to talk about that, their senior management team, that, they talked too much about change as if things were wrong. Whereas what they should have been talking about is renewal or refreshing, about making things slightly better. And out of that, believe it or not, that one conversation with a member of staff in a call center came with this idea that they ought to believe in better. Everything you can do can be improved and better. Last story. You've got all these broadcast tools at your disposal to engage widely with all your people and to get them to understand what you're trying to achieve. You can cascade and communicate and roll out and do a town hall. I'm going to try and show you a video. Bryony, hopefully the little video will work, but I'm going to try a little video. It's only 45 seconds long, but it's a tech leader. It's probably not the most famous tech leader in the world, but the other guy. Not the guy who's sending up rockets, but the one who's now started sending up rockets. He's basically, I think, is at the new center where they're building one of these rockets to go to space. Is a part of that venture. And he just meets a member of staff. And what I want you to do is I just want you to watch that. Remember that I'm not knocking this guy. He's built a business which is extraordinary, and a franchise which is probably one of the most famous brands in the world. But you just judge this. How does it's Jeff? How does Jeff get on?
Hey, good, thank you.
You're doing a great job.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate
that.
I've been in the business 36 years, and
Really appreciate that.
I'll tell you now, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, United Technologies, I worked for all three for more than 10 years. Best company I ever worked for.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
That's
Thank you for taking the time to tell me that.
I will. This will be my last job.
All right. Thank you. That's so nice.
That's always good to hear.
What a sweet thing to say.
That's awesome. And now I'll slip in the 20 on the way out.
I know. I didn't even tip him. I mean,
I don't know. I saw this, it went viral online. I don't know what you think about it. It's a nice moment in a way, this guy. But yeah, he just has a moment there to listen and he passes on it. The guy had 36 years with 3 other organizations that are amazing and all that knowledge and experience. And he said to Jeff, "You work for I'm never going to work. What you're doing here is amazing." Wasn't Jeff even just briefly intrigued to know why? I just think it's interesting. So I'm not knocking multi-billionaire Jeff. I'm sure he's done very well for all sorts of other reasons. But those chances to listen, those chances to engage, I think are really, really powerful. So I'll commend it to you. It's this idea called glue. There's a couple of other things I can share if we get time, Andy. But I do think it's about that. It's about galvanizing others, listening. It's about engaging widely and deeply across the organization and making that more of your diary and more of your time at the expense of other things. You've got to drop some of the plates, but focus on this piece here. It's likely to have more of an impact. Work out who your valuable people are. Go out there and embrace them. That's what I advise.
John, thank you. That's absolutely perfect. I was talking this morning at an event about emotional well-being amongst people. It was one of the police recovery centres. And one of the things that gets missed an awful lot is that social connection. When we're working remotely, we don't meet up at the coffee machine. We don't have those little pieces of interaction with each other, which is an exchange of attention. And that's one of our essential human emotion needs, is to feel that we're receiving attention from others, and also that we're able to give attention to others, because it's nutritious both ways. And I think in building relationships, it was always those moments for me that, as I said earlier, made me feel great. I remember every leader that made me feel much better as I walked away from them, having had a couple of minutes to communicate with them, than I did, before I joined them. And that's that social connection piece that you're talking about, the social collateral you get from, those interactions. And I know you were saying to me before, the different kind of leadership that we need now in the world. It feels very much for me like it's because of all the different generations, it's having that ability to socially engineer or socially connect with people in little bite-sized pieces.
Yeah, I mean, there's stories in the book of, these leaders where, I worked for a gentleman, he had 44 countries, 1,000 people, global function. He'd only meet people maybe once a year in person. He'd often connect them in other ways, but somehow was able to devote energy to do that. Now, he found a compensating way of doing that. He had a chief of staff who did some other things for him, so it freed up the time. But that's what that organization did. If you're going to run a business with 44 territories around the world, someone's got to create the glue. Someone's got to create the connectivity. The other thing I'd just offer you, just if I may, Andy, you were saying you're at the police today. I think there's also as well, and I don't want to go too deep or too dark on this, but I think there's also like a moral imperative for leaders now, because organizations are one of the few things now where people coalesce. People are socializing less, people are going out less, people are volunteering less, church memberships are falling, all sorts of things are going less. There's a wonderful book about this in the US called Bowling Alone, which was about in the US where people are going into their own little micro worlds and are not connected with others. And organizations are one of the few people while we still do this. And in fact, you and Dinesh and Brian are still trying to find a way of doing that amongst people who otherwise would be disparate and apart. Andy, I've got 1 minute for one last story.
Absolutely, please do, John.
I'll give you the one last story on this. I think
you've got a good 10 minutes left.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, I just there's I'm not going to pitch you my book because it's available and all that. But there's a new book out. I found that I don't think anybody's come across this called The Anxious Generation. A guy called John Haidt, he's written this book. It's mainly about, I think, what you might call sort of latter millennials or Gen Z who are now entering the workplace. So they've had their education in the first part of this century. And he says there's this great rewiring going on, which serves connect everybody in the world while disconnecting them from the people around them. And if anybody on the line's got a teenager, you know all about this. They're better connected and more informed and more able to access the whole world of connections than we ever were 20 years ago. But in a way, they seem less connected from the people closest to them and around them. Yeah, go for supper with two teenagers. It's amazing. Give it a try. Okay, so he did that, but he's actually said a couple of other things. He went a little bit darker. The propensity for mental health difficulties amongst that generation is more profound than it's ever been. Okay, it's more profound than it's ever been. And he says people don't get depressed when they feel threats collectively. They get depressed when they feel isolated, lonely, or useless. And this really struck me. I mean, I did a little bit, I mentioned this book, Bowling Alone. This guy, Putnam, talked about this happening in the United States. They're wrestling with some of the consequences of this because, as with many things, the US is 5 or 10 years ahead of us on some of these social trends. But, people are disconnected. He called it bowling alone, where people still go to the bowling alley and bowl, but it's them versus the machine. They're not playing against anybody else. It's just them, a man on his own playing against a machine. Very sad idea when you think about bowling used to be a big social thing in the US. And you might be familiar with this quote from William Gibson. If you look around the world, you sometimes see things before they land here. And as I said, I'm fortunate to work with a global business school, so I meet people from all over the world. And I heard a story from April of last year. It's a true story. April of last year. I mentioned the flimsiness of things, but if I got this story right, yeah, this was April of last year. Someone sent me this story. It's a true story. The South Korean government issued a new law. Basically, it was a new benefit that they were issuing to society. And basically what they did, the benefit was you could apply for a grant of $500 the equivalent of $500 US, 500 US in South Korea, the equivalent. It's quite a chunk of money. The only qualification you needed for that $500, does anybody know? If anybody knows this story, the only qualification you needed for that $500 was to leave your apartment. That's all you had to do. You had to go to the mall or go to the shops or go to the cinema or go to the theater or go to a park or go to a museum. They would fund whatever you wanted to do up to $500 just so you left your apartment. Because in South Korea, they did this allowance of $500. When they did it, 385,000, mainly young men, were eligible for this allowance. And the birth rate in South Korea is now, I think, the lowest in the world. People aren't going out, they're not connecting, they're working, they're online, they've got jobs, they're employed. I think South Korea is a G20 country, it's a very wealthy place. People are better connected than ever been. They can work, but they never leave. So if they have any personal relationship with anybody, it's only going to be the people they live with. And if they have any intimacy with anybody, it's going to be online, which is a bit sad. I told this story to a group, an international group a couple of months ago, and there's a gentleman there from Japan, and he said, yeah, in Japan, it's got a term for it. They call it hikikomori. It's called an epidemic of loneliness. 1.5 million lonely people. 1.5 million people who are diagnosed as being lonely. I think there's about 70 million people in Japan, and 1.5 million are lonely. So when I said there's like a moral imperative in this creating connection and collaboration, and Andy, you mentioned the coffee moment. I know a lot of organizations do millions of other things like that. They really matter. They really, really, really matter. No one chooses to be lonely. No one chooses to be lonely. Just in the same way that Putnam saw, people didn't choose to bowl alone. Not everybody has to scroll alone. Do you know what I mean? I just think it's really important. What you do in terms of creating connectivity amongst the people is not just good for the business. It's not just good for productivity. It's actually almost like a moral imperative. And if you do it well, you really, really do great good.
I think that's a great point to end on. I remember a long time ago, someone said that the companies of the future be the ones that do the online stuff exceptionally well, but also get together face to face and celebrate those successes together as a team. But you're absolutely right. Emotional intimacy in a sense of the way that two individuals connect. I don't think you can put a price on that, especially when it comes to business these days. John, thank you so much. I've got to give you a lot of praise for your slides. Amazing.
It's
Love
them. It's all right. No, it's a pleasure. It's an honor. And I think everybody's got your camera on and seems to be still with me. But as I said, it's not about, Andy, it's not about being a superhero. It's not about changing who you are. It's about rocking up as who you are, and that being great and fine and normal. And I think sometimes when people end up in leadership roles, two things happen. One is you're being watched and observed all the time. So what you do and the way you behave really does matter because it has an impact on others. And secondly, the way you role model some of your behaviors, people imitate them as well. So if you're connecting and collaborating and giving it time and using both ears as well as one mouth, it's enormously powerful.
Well, John, I'm sure there's plenty of questions in the chat. So I'm going to ask Steve Maxwell to step forward and take us through some questions for you that are coming through from the community.
Thank you.